This is what I think is dangerous about the US political alignment at the moment. You have the right wingers like Crenshaw and Graham that want to bomb the cartels.
Hmm.
And then you've got these kind of establishment liberals like, what From Now is, and Applebaum, who will now have a cause. They have a cause, right? They want to save Mexico from an autocrat. This could potentially become a perfect storm. You've got the right wing argument of just bomb, and you've got, which is even more pernicious, I think, this establishment liberal interventionist cause. We're going to
Hmm.
save Mexico from itself. And that could potentially dovetail in kind of nefarious ways.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. For decades, Mexico was run by two parties that had a stranglehold over politics, with one president after another aligning themselves closely with U.S. interests. Then came Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, in 2018, propelled to power by the Morena Party, the largest progressive political project in the region. Since taking office in 2018, AMLO and Morena, through their Fourth Transformation Project, have invested heavily in infrastructure that benefits the working class, while taking concrete steps to address violence against women. He's also reasserted the state's control over Mexico's natural resources, even nationalizing its lithium reserves, while vocally opposing U.S. interference in Mexico. So it's no surprise that the corporate press in North America has been labeling him a strongman, an authoritarian, and anti democratic, while U.S. politicians like Lindsay Graham invoke drugs and violence to threaten military intervention. To discuss what's really going on, I'm joined by Kurt Hackbarth, a journalist who's currently co authoring a book on the 2018 Mexican election. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The rest is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Kurt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Rania. Pleasure to be here.
It's so good to have you on. And I think you are in Mexico City, if I'm not mistaken, right?
I'm in Oaxaca, actually, the beautiful city of Oaxaca.
All right, then. Thank you for correcting me on that. So there's so much to talk about here. I had
Yeah.
the privilege of being in Mexico a couple weeks ago, and me and my colleague Zoe Alexandra from People's Dispatch got to interview Claudia Scheinbaum, who's
Mhm.
the head of government in Mexico City, and as you know, is expected to be the front runner in next year's presidential election. And we can maybe talk a little bit about all that coming up. But first, I want to start with some of the mainstream US media coverage that we've been seeing in recent months about the Mexican president, AMLO, which has been, I think it's actually been happening for the past couple of years, but the last few months it seems to have gone like into overdrive. This attempt to frame him as, some sort of autocrat or like dictator like figure who's putting in place really anti-democratic measures. Here, for example, is the Washington Post. I'm sorry for the way it looks. They have horrible ads at the front, but this is Fareed Zakaria, writing for the Washington Post. The headline says, Mexico's populist demagogue president is gutting fair elections. And that was published back in March, so just last month. And then we have a few other pieces I just want to show. This one is in the Financial Times. And the title, for those who are just listening, is AMLO's Strongman Act is Weakening Mexico. And then the subheading is The President's Attacks on National Institutions Threaten Democracy and Stability. And then we have one of our favorite people on this show, Kurt, the one and only David Frum at The Atlantic. For those who don't know, David Frum was one of the top liars in the Bush administration to help lie us into the Iraq War. And I think he's still like a proponent of the Iraq War 20 years later, which shows you how committed he is to, to that sort of agenda. But here he is writing this piece for The Atlantic on Mexico called The Autocrat Next Door. Liberal democracy in Mexico is under assault. Worse, the attacker is the country's own president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So that's all just to show a few examples among many, which is something that you wrote about at Jacobin, of
Right.
this attempt to frame AMLO, who was democratically elected, and also his term is almost over and he's going to step down afterwards. Frame him as this horrible dictator, this horrible autocrat. And I mean, most of this fear mongering, as you've written, was prompted by this electoral reform bill that AMLO was backing. So, anyways, all that's to just set it up to for you to set the record straight for us. What was that bill? And was AMLO indeed trying to destroy democracy in Mexico, or is this about something else?
Yeah, the short answer is no, and it very clearly has to do with something else. And I'm sure we'll get to that in a minute. As you very clearly stated, López Obrador was democratically elected in 2018 by an overwhelming majority, and his party, Morena, also won a majority in both houses of Congress, and they won that majority again in the midterm elections of 2021. So López Obrador has an electoral mandate like no other Mexican president in history. And he's also maintained 70% or so approval rating over the course of his 5 years in office. So what you see here, and this has been going on since AMLO was elected, is a coordinated campaign from the Anglo-American press. Also, The Economist has also been hysterical about AMLO, to paint him as very much in their way of seeing Latin America in general as a messianic, autocratic dictator, tin pot dictator who is weakening Mexico's democratic institutions, as if those democratic institutions worked so well before. Really, electoral democracy in Mexico began in 2018 with the election of López Obrador, and not, this the election of 2000, which was supposedly inaugurated the era of the opposition, which was just flipping between two right-wing parties, right? The PAN, the right-wing party, and the PRI, the hegemonic party of state during most of the 20th century. So what you see here is this idea that democracy is only bestowed by people in suits, by neoliberal approved institutions like the National Electoral Institute, the INE, when in reality, democracy in Mexico came from below, a large popular movement that had to contend against a fraud in 2006, a very dirty election in 2012. AMLO won on the third try. And over the years, the Electoral Institute has proven itself unable or unwilling to attack electoral frauds. Enrique Peña Nieto, in his 2012 electoral victory, overspent the campaign spending limit some 13 times, according to a congressional review. The INE did nothing about it. Governors from many states controlled by the PRI diverted funds from state budgets to pay for favorable electoral coverage, to spend on campaigns. All this was illegal. The INE never did a thing about it. So then you get people like David from The Atlantic trying to whitewash this institution, because he comes down, spends a little time in the richest districts of Mexico City, talks to the then head of the INE, and then goes back to write a little article in The Atlantic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ann Applebaum also wrote a ridiculous piece in The Atlantic along the same lines. They come down here, dance around in fancy hotels, right, and go to right-wing rallies, and think they now are, authorities on Mexico.
Yeah. It's actually stunning. I mean, this is something that these kinds of Western correspondents, and in this case, I mean, these are actually pretty big wigs. Usually David Frum isn't traveling to other countries. Neither does Ann Applebaum, not typically. So it actually shows just how much there is a fear of AMLO and the Morena party more generally, that they're sending the bigwigs down to go talk to the right wingers there and promote them as though they represent the country. And when I was there, I got the I was able to attend the one of the mañaneras, which is the daily press conference that AMLO does, which was a really cool experience. I mean, for those who don't know, AMLO does these daily press conferences that typically last, I think, about 3 hours, and they're really early in the morning too. It's kind of amazing, where he comes, he speaks. Sometimes he's joined by other people in his administration, depending on what the subject matter is, and then he opens it up to questions. And then the press is there, asks questions. There's often a back and forth, and it's aired on TV. So a few million people watch every day. I think something like 3 million people, possibly more, because a lot of clips are shown in other media outlets throughout the day, and then of course online. And I got to ask a question, which was pretty cool. But also Zoe Alexandra, my colleague, got to ask a question. And the reason I bring that up is because, and this is just to give people an idea of how popular AMLO is, because of his like kind of way of talking to people directly every day with these press conferences. As Zoe and I were walking through Mexico City, like downtown, I think it was like 2 days later, by the way, after the day that we'd asked those questions. And Zoe was recognized by somebody who was like
Because
an
she'd been
AMLO
at the
supporter.
Mañanera.
Yeah, yeah. And she'd
Yeah.
asked a question. So she was, I mean, it was just like a quick question too. I mean, she was maybe, her face was on there talking, and she speaks Spanish. She also translated my question because I don't speak Spanish. So she was on there for maybe like a couple of minutes. And then this whole family like recognized her, asked to take a selfie with her, starts talking about like they were like this working class family starts talking about how much they love AMLO and why. And it was just, I mean, to me, that was pretty cool. Kind of like has like a Chavez feel to it in a way, you know, where it's not as long as, of course, like a Chavez speech, but these daily sort of conversations where people are hearing from their president. I mean, I couldn't imagine Biden doing that every day. But I guess I raised that to say, like, he's quite the popular figure. You mentioned like a 70% approval rating. I mean, when is the last time a US president had a 70% approval rating? So then the question becomes, like, why does the US feel so threatened by him? What is it that AMLO has done? You talked a little bit about sort of his trajectory in politics, how he ran in 2006 and faced the electoral fraud, which I'd actually like you to elaborate a bit more on. Ran again in 2012, finally wins in 2018. So what is it? What is AMLO doing that has Lindsay Graham, as well as people like Bob Menendez, and then
Yeah.
the entire corporate press in the US, like up in arms about him?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Just a couple of quick comments as well. That 70% approval rating, let's recall, has been, including the years of the pandemic, right, which has tanked the approval rating of many other world leaders. And despite a steady barrage of negative press, both domestically and internationally. You know, it's one thing to have a 70% approval rating when you have the corporate press on your side, right?
Yeah.
Sycophants. It's another thing to have that degree of approval when the headlines are constantly negative, constantly, and on television, and on radio, and on the private networks, and even on the public ones. So that's a testament to that. And the Mañanera, I think, is very important as well to point out, as you experienced, is what the AMLO calls a circular dialogue. You know, AMLO receives questions, gives information, but there's also sometimes a very tense back and forth on a lot of issues. And a lot of important things have come out over the course of the Mañaneras, just like AMLO mentioned yesterday, the Pentagon spying on the Mexican government, right? So I think that's very important. We saw that the two Sanders campaigns were unable to break, you know, the constant negative media coverage, and it sank them. We saw how the press in Great Britain destroyed Jeremy Corbyn, and they didn't find an effective way of combating that. The Mañanera has been a very effective way of rebutting the constant negative press coverage and getting the other message out there. So I think that's something progressive movements around the world should take a very close look at. Now, with regards to what's behind these United States attacks, well, there are two very clear reasons. One of them is resource nationalism. And that is that López Obrador has been very clear that he wants to regain energy sovereignty for Mexico. And that means taking control of its natural resources and of its electrical grid. Mexico's electrical grid was basically in the hands of multinationals like Spain's Iberdrola, like Enel from Italy, and others, like we see now in Europe with, you know, rising energy bills and privatized energy grids over there. So one of his big laws a couple of years ago was an energy reform law saying, look, the public grid is public, and the public grid has to receive public sources of energy first. And then if there's any more need, then we'll buy from private energy sources. Well, of course, Iberdrola and all these companies went through the roof. And of course, Ken Salazar, the American ambassador, himself a longtime lobbyist for fossil fuel interests in the United States, who has now tried to reinvent himself in Mexico as a green guru, right, for green energy, right, was down here saying, we don't like this energy reform. And he was going back and forth and going to National Palace every 2 days eventually the energy reform passed. They tried to pass a constitutional measure that didn't pass, but they passed in a standard law. It was declared constitutional. And just a few weeks ago, AMLO announced that that Mexico is buying 13 energy plants owned by Iberdrola and restoring them to public function.
Wow.
So that means that's a big deal. So before that purchase, Mexico produced 39% of its energy publicly, and that will now go up to 55%. And the goal is to get up to 65% public energy production by the end of his term. Basically, Iberdrola fought AMLO, a huge lawfare campaign, took him to court, tried to block everything. They stared him in the eye and lost.
Wow.
Iberdrola is packing up and they're leaving Mexico. And you know where they're going? They're going to the U.S., where the energy laws are much more permissive in this respect, right? Among other markets. Right? So that's one thing. And then the other one is the nationalization of Mexico's lithium stores. It has amongst the largest lithium stores in the world, in the state of Sonora, dangerously close to the U.S. border. And together with Argentina, Chile, Peru, and look what happened in Peru.
Yeah.
They're looking to create a pan-Latin American lithium initiative to not just mine lithium, but to actually create batteries and create refined products. So that's one thing. And the other one is, that's a big no-no for the United States, from the Wolfowitz Doctrine and even before. Mexico is adopting a regional role of leadership in Latin America. And the United States just can't permit that.
No, that's really well said and so true. I mean, Mexico is, of course, bordering the United States. And the U.S. for a long time has had control. You mentioned the two parties, PRI and PAN, which was like the sort of two-party right-wing stranglehold over Mexican politics until 2018, basically, when AMLO was elected. And you also mentioned the two times that he had run before and failed. First, I guess, can you talk a little bit about what happened in 2006? Because Mexico does have a very robust right wing, though they're kind of like in chaos now and aren't well organized. But historically, they have been. I think they can control for like 40 years until the rise of AMLO and Morena. But I guess first, what happened in 2006 with the electoral fraud? Because I've actually heard you talk about that before, and I didn't know just how bad that was. And it's kind of stunning.
It was really bad.
Go from there, yeah.
It was really, really bad. The background to that is AMLO had been elected mayor of Mexico City in the year 2000 and was a very popular mayor, right? Instituted a lot of the social programs that he's then instituted at the national level as president. So then President Vicente Fox, seeing how popular he was, trumped up a charge against AMLO, basically that he disobeyed a judicial order to build a connecting road to a hospital, and tried to keep him off the ballot in 2006. That was the affair that was known as the desafuero. And in Mexico, if charges are brought against you, the Congress can vote to strip you of your political immunity, and that doesn't allow you to run. So basically, they tried to keep AMLO off the ballot by the most authoritarian anti-democratic measure possible, the desafuero affair. This was 2004, 2005. There was a huge public outcry, and Fox had to back off and said, all right, we'll let AMLO on the ballot. But he said, all right, I'm going to get my revenge against him another way. And that was intervening directly in the 2006 election, as he's later admitted. I mean, he's just said as much. The 2006 election was my desquite, or my revenge against López Obrador. So there was a massive media campaign against AMLO. The IFE, the Federal Electoral Institute, which is the precursor to the INE now, the National Electoral Institute, was headed by someone called Luis Carlos Ugalde. And they cooked the election from the inside. Just a few days before the election, it came out that the whole electoral roll was in the hands of the PAN, was in the hands of the right-wing party, because the person who was running the computer system for the IFE at that point, Hildebrando, was a family member of Calderon's wife. How about that? Right? So the night of the election, they made it in such a way that the results that came in made sure that Calderon never lost his lead. And then about at 3 a.m., right, deep late in the night, was when you could see the lines cross on the television. They did a study in the UNAM subsequently that it was statistically impossible because supposedly Calderon won by a half a percentage point. It's statistically impossible to have one person winning the whole time.
Mm.
In an election with a half a percentage point difference, you go back and forth, as we've seen in a lot of elections. So they artificially made it that Calderon was ahead the entire time. It was just a terrible thing where in a lot of precincts, there were more ballots cast than people registered in that precinct or less. A lot of the precincts would have like Calderon winning 100 votes more. So it looked, or 1,000 more. I mean, so it would look like the same number unless you looked very closely.
Mm.
Of course, there was a big outcry against it. López Obrador occupied the Zócalo of Mexico City and two of the main streets in protest for several months, demanding something very simple, which was a full recount, which seems the most basic option. The courts here refused. They just did a very partial recount of just a small number of precincts, where each one was found to be different than the regular result. Anointed Calderon president in September of that year. And, by December, the war on drugs started. Mexico's war on drugs started, which has killed up to 200,000 people, has torn apart the social fabric of this country, and has led to the situation we're in today, where the United States wants to invade. All of this came about because of that electoral fraud. That's the genesis of this. And then a few years later, what did they do? They burnt the ballots so that nobody could ever track this down and do a final count.
It's like mafia
They decided
style.
to burn them. Yeah, it's mafia style.
Yeah. I'm sure Anne Applebaum and David Frum were like on the case.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sure they were very, very concerned about that.
Waiting for their investigative deep dives into what happened in 2006. That's actually a wild story. I'm surprised. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just had to make my Anne Applebaum joke, but go ahead.
No, and I think, why is AMLO so popular, right? Because the United States is so superficial and so racist with regards to Mexico. They think, well, he's just a messianic leader and the people are dumb and they passively kind of, love their charismatic leader and they're brainwashed. Mm-hmm. Actually, people favor López Obrador because they've seen where he's been. López Obrador, at the beginning of his career, when the first earlier left-wing party, the PRD, won its first municipal victories in the 80s, was fighting for that. He ran for governor in Tabasco in 1994 against a PRI candidate who spent more than Bill Clinton had spent in his presidential campaign, right? And faced a fraud there. So López Obrador has been at the forefront of the whole movement to open up Mexico from the 80s onward. He headed what was called the March for Democracy in 1994. They marched from Tabasco to Mexico City, which is no small distance, camped out in Mexico City to make sure that those PRD victories were recognized, won the mayorship in Mexico City in 2000, and then has had to fight the 2006 election, which we just talked about, the 2012 election, which was an imposition of a television-created president in Peña Nieto, a U.S. tool, and had to fight against that, and never stopped. He never stopped. He didn't give up. Right? Yeah. He didn't do an Al Gore or whatever. Kept going, and finally won in 2018. And people see that. People aren't, people have agency. People aren't, dumb and brainwashed, as the U.S. press constantly tries to make out the Mexican public to be.
Right. And then, of course, there's the role of the Morena party, which he's a co-founder of. Right. Can you talk a little bit about the Morena party and what is, like, I know it's like an umbrella kind of coalition, right? And it's quite large. I think it's like the largest progressive political organization at this point in the region. And what was the significance of Morena in helping propel AMLO to power?
So Morena becomes a political party in 2014. The earlier political party was the Party of the Democratic Revolution, the PRD, which was founded after an earlier electoral fraud in 1988 by Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas. By 2014, it was very clear that the PRD had been co-opted to the point of being basically useless as a left-wing party. Right? So fortunately, Mexico has public financing of campaigns, so that allowed Mexico to do what appears to be impossible in the United States, is form another left party. And that was Morena, which means it stands for Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, National Regeneration Movement, but the abbreviation also means Morena, a dark-skinned woman. So that's obviously a very symbolic thing there. And there was a large debate at the time as to whether Morena should remain a movement or should become a political party. And I think that's a very healthy debate because, if you become a political party, you can very easily become, swallowed by the system and the board there and the electoral board and only become merely an electoral vehicle. And you lose your movement part. And that's actually a problem that Morena is experiencing now. It's a victim of its own success, right? Mm-hmm. So, it's been so electorally successful that it's becoming very much more of an electoral party than a movement. Anyway, the debate was that Morena should become a party. It became a party in 2014, ran in its first congressional elections a few years later, and picked up, a respectable number of seats. And then in 2018 wins the presidency. I mean, it's a delirious rise for a party to become a political party and then 4 years later win the presidency. Remember in your interview with Claudia Sheinbaum, she said at the beginning people didn't want to be part of Morena because they thought it was a long shot at the beginning. And now everybody wants to be a candidate for Morena. And so people are parachuting in from other parties, which is a problem.
Right.
So, now you get to a point where Morena has the presidency, has both houses of Congress in coalition, and has 23 of the 32 governorships, and is set to pick up another one in the state of Mexico, the largest, most populous state, in a couple of months. So Morena's success has been vertiginous in that respect. And yes, it is kind of a rainbow party in the sense of there are people who are more on the center, right? People like Marcelo Obrador, who is the foreign secretary, who's also presidential candidate, right? People like Ricardo Monreal, who's on the right of the party. But there's also people farther to the left, like Sheinbaum or Fernandez Noroña, or AMLO himself, which is why the left of the party is rallying mostly around Sheinbaum to be their next candidate, right? And there are also remnants of the older, smaller parties in Mexico, this older socialist party, the older communist party, which have gone out of existence, but they're in there too.
Yeah.
So it's a big tent party, not without its tensions.
Of course.
One of the big issues right now is AMLO has introduced a very stiff mining reform measure because Mexico has very permissive mining laws. United States and Canadian companies control over 80% of the mining extraction industry in Mexico, and he's trying to clamp down on that.
Yeah.
So now, there's tensions within Morena to get that law introduced and passed.
It's interesting. Yeah, Morena definitely, for the little time I spent there, I did get to kind of see that ideological diversity. You've got socialists in the party who actually have critiques of the leadership, on certain issues like immigration, for example. Of course, they'd like them to be even more left-wing on economics. And then you've got, people who are kind of on the right a little bit. Not the right, in the US context, but definitely are more pro-corporate, more pro-US, those sorts of people. So it definitely is an umbrella coalition. And an umbrella coalition, of course, it does open up the possibility of clashes at some point, if not now. So definitely, that must be a difficult thing to have to deal with. And I also do want to talk to you about the right wing, which is the other side of this, and the sort of right wing in Mexico and what they're up to these days. There does seem to be, although they're kind of in disarray inside Mexico, there does seem to be a bit of a level of organization with other right-wing forces in the region. But before we get to that, I think that this is also a part of that same conversation. I do want to talk about the role of the U.S. here, because the U.S. is very much like in line with the Mexican right as well as the rest of the Latin American right, as we know. And, you know, we did see, I think the biggest thing that most people saw, even if they don't pay so much attention to Mexico, but they're somewhat politically aware, is they saw this whole sort of like back and forth between Lindsey Graham and AMLO when it came to the issue of threatening military intervention in Mexico. And I just want to play this clip that Breakthrough News put together. Some self-promotion here, just to kind of set it up for those who missed it or maybe need to be reminded.
I want to empower our military to use lethal force against drug cartels, blow up their labs, go after them individually because they're a great threat to the country. These are evil people.
Nosotros no vamos a permitir que intervenga ningún gobierno extranjero, y mucho menos que intervengan fuerzas armadas de un gobierno extranjero en nuestro territorio. Esta iniciativa de los republicanos, además de irresponsable, es una ofensa.
That's step one. Name them for what they are, terrorist organizations. Step two is give the military the power as the last resort, if Mexico won't help, to blow these damn labs up and kill the people who are killing us.
Es una actitud prepotente, alevosa, majadera, desde luego intervencionista al pueblo de México, una falta de respeto a nuestra independencia, a nuestra soberanía.
So I just wanted to show that was, of course, for those who are just listening, it was a back and forth of like Lindsey Graham making threats and then AMLO responding during his press conferences when he was asked about it. And there was more than that. I mean, he kept responding. You could probably play like at least an hour of clips between the two, because Lindsey Graham then went on to basically say he was, I don't know if he actually did yet, but he was going to introduce a bill to classify Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations. I guess the reason I raise all this is not just because it was a big issue recently, but like, what is this really about? You actually know, I mean, the interesting aspect of this, and I'd like for you to talk about this, is you did write this piece for Jacobin about the U.S. complicity with drug cartels, specifically noting that back in February, there was this federal U.S. court ruling that found a former Mexican Secretary of Public Security guilty of colluding with the cartels, and that he was actually working very closely with American agencies. And that's just one of like many examples that we could even that exist of like the U.S. role in actually, you know, this sort of complicity with these Mexican mafias, cartels, whatever you want to call them. So I guess all that's to say, like, what's happening here? Why all of a sudden is Lindsey Graham threatening military intervention? Obviously, it's not really about drugs and cartels if the U.S. is in bed with these people.
Right.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews.